The pen was already in my hand when Grandpa Ned grabbed my wrist. Not gently, not the way a 78-year-old man with arthritis moves. He grabbed me the way he once grabbed a live wire on a job site in 1987, like letting go meant death. "Marcus," his voice was gravel wrapped in rust, "look at me." I looked, his eyes, pale blue, always pale blue, the color of winter sky over the wheat fields he grew up on, were doing something I hadn't seen since my grandmother's funeral. They were afraid. "Before you sign that paper," he said, "you tell me exactly what Richard told you to say about the Fenwick account." The conference room went quiet. My lawyer, Richard Hale, $3,000 suit, Yale cufflinks, a handshake that had closed $40 million in deals, went very, very still. And right there, at the apex of the greatest moment of my professional life, with a $15 million acquisition check sitting on a glass table in downtown Chicago, I realized my grandfather had just saved me from prison. Let me back up 18 months. I built Stacklane from a spare bedroom and a maxed-out credit card. B2B workflow software, nothing glamorous, but it worked. God, it worked. And within 3 years we had 200 enterprise clients and a team of 41 people who believed in something. When Vertex Technologies came calling with an acquisition offer, I thought I was living the dream that the startup blogs wrote about. The exit, the number with too many zeros, the vindication. Grandpa Ned had come to live with me the previous spring, after my grandmother passed. He didn't need a caregiver. He needed, as he put it, something to do that wasn't watching television and waiting. So he came to Chicago from his farmhouse in Galesburg, Illinois, and he sat in on company meetings and made coffee that was aggressively too strong and asked questions that made my senior engineers squirm with their precision. He'd never built a tech company. He'd built houses. 40 years of residential construction, starting as a laborer, ending as the owner of a small firm that never went public and never made headlines and never once, in 4 decades, had a lawsuit filed against it. That last part, I would come to understand, was the whole point. Richard Hale entered my life through a mutual connection 6 months before the Vertex deal, polished, connected, a deal attorney who specialized in tech acquisitions. He came highly recommended. He wore confidence the way other men wear cologne, too much of it, everywhere, all the time. Grandpa Ned shook his hand the first day they met and said nothing for a full 30 seconds, just held the handshake and looked at him. "Firm grip," he finally said. Richard laughed. Grandpa Ned did not. The due diligence process was brutal. Vertex's acquisition team spent 90 days inside our systems, our contracts, our financials. They were thorough in the way that only people spending other people's money can afford to be. And somewhere around day 60, they found the Fenwick account. Fenwick Industrial was one of our earliest clients. We'd given them a sweetheart contract in our desperate early days, significantly discounted, with a revenue share arrangement that, in retrospect, had been drafted sloppily by a contract attorney I'd paid $600 and a case of beer. The arrangement was technically structured as a liability on our books, not a big one, not a fraudulent one, but an unusual one that, depending on how you characterized it, could shave real money off our valuation. Richard came to my apartment one evening, not the office, my apartment, which I should have noticed, and walked me through the Fenwick situation. He was calm, methodical, reassuring. "Here's what we are going to do," he said, spreading papers on my kitchen counter. "In your representations to Vertex, you're going to characterize the Fenwick arrangement as a standard deferred revenue item, not a liability, deferred revenue." I looked at the papers. "Richard, that's not what it is." "It's close enough." "Is it legally?" "Marcus," he put his hand on my shoulder, the hand of a man who had done this before. "This is how deals get done. This is the language. Nobody gets hurt. Vertex's people will move on." He was convincing. He was so convincing. He had a way of making dishonesty sound like wisdom, like I was the naive one for thinking categories mattered, for thinking the difference between liability and deferred revenue was more than a semantic choice. I was 34 years old, and I had 41 employees whose livelihoods depended on this deal closing. I almost signed. Grandpa Ned found out about the Fenwick issue the way he found out about everything. He listened when people thought he wasn't. He was making his terrible coffee in the kitchen the morning after Richard's visit. He heard more than I realized. He didn't say anything that day or the next. Ned was not a man who spoke before he was ready. What he did instead was make 3 phone calls. I know this because he told me afterward. The first was to a retired accountant in Galesburg who had done his business taxes for 30 years. The second was to his son, my Uncle Dale, a man who had worked in corporate finance and left it, as he always said, before it got in my blood. The third call, the one that mattered most, was to a former client of Richard Hale's, a tech founder who had sold a company 4 years earlier. A man whose deal had been structured by Richard using very similar language around a very similar accounting discrepancy. That founder's name was Jason Teff. His deal had closed. He'd taken his money. And 18 months later, the SEC had come knocking because the acquirer, upon discovering the misrepresentation, had filed a complaint. Jason Teff had paid back $2.1 million in fines and spent 8 months under a deferred prosecution agreement that essentially ended his ability to work in the industry. Richard Hale had not been disciplined. Richard Hale had moved on to the next deal. Grandpa Ned had all of this information for 4 days before the closing. He sat with it. He drank his terrible coffee and watched the city from my living room window and said nothing, and I mistook his silence for acceptance. Back in the conference room, the pen was still in my hand. Ned's grip on my wrist had not loosened. Richard was speaking, his voice taking on the particular smoothness of a man performing damage control. Ned, this isn't really Marcus. We should probably have this conversation privately. Marcus asked me what you told him to say about the Fenwick account, Ned said. He wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at me. Tell me in your own words, not his. So I did, slowly, out loud, in front of the 3 Vertex representatives sitting across the table, who had gone so still they looked photographed. I repeated what Richard had instructed me to say. Deferred revenue, not a liability. Standard characterization. Then Grandpa Ned, this man who had built houses in central Illinois for 40 years and never once filed a lawsuit, reached into the breast pocket of his sport coat and placed a single sheet of paper on the glass table. It was a printout of a court document. Jason Teff's SEC filing. Richard Hale's name appeared in the case record as the structuring attorney. I'd like a 10-minute recess, Ned said. He wasn't asking. What happened next took longer than 10 minutes. The Vertex team asked Richard to leave the room. One of their representatives, a woman named Claire Huang, who had the expression of someone who had seen this particular movie before, made 2 phone calls. Richard spent 45 minutes in the hallway. I spent those 45 minutes with my grandfather in a small side room, sitting in silence while he drank bad vending machine coffee, and I stared at the wall. I almost signed, I said. I know. How did you know he was doing it again, with me? He thought about this for a long time, because he didn't explain the risk, he finally said. In 40 years of construction, any time a contractor told me something was standard practice and didn't explain what happened if things went wrong, that was always the moment to stop and ask what they weren't saying. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Richard told you what to write. He didn't tell you what happened if Vertex found it later. That's not an oversight, that's a choice. The deal didn't die. That surprised me most. The Fenwick account, disclosed properly and accurately as a modest legacy liability, reduced the final acquisition price by $340,000. A real number, a painful number, but a legal one. Vertex's team, it emerged, had already half suspected something was unusual about Fenwick. Claire Huang told me privately that clean disclosure at closing, rather than buried misrepresentation discovered post-close, actually increased their confidence in everything else we'd told them. We closed at $14.66 million. I signed the papers at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October. My grandfather watched from a chair against the wall, his hands folded in his lap. Richard Hale was not present. His firm received no commission from that deal. 3 months later, he was the subject of a bar complaint, not from me, but from Jason Teff, who had been waiting for a corroborating case to file. Richard's license was suspended pending investigation. Last I heard, it had not been reinstated. I've been asked many times since what the lesson was. Entrepreneurs want a framework, a checklist, a way to structuralize the near miss into actionable takeaways. I never know what to tell them, except this. My grandfather built things that stood up, not because he was brilliant, not because he had access to resources or mentors or the right network, because he had a simple operating principle that he applied without exception for 40 years. If someone tells you to do something and won't explain what happens when it goes wrong, they are planning on being gone when it goes wrong. That's it, that's the whole thing. He's 80 now, he still makes terrible coffee. He still sits in on meetings when I'll let him, at the new company, the one we're building quietly and carefully, and with every number exactly where it actually belongs. Last week, a new attorney came in to discuss our next round of financing. Nice guy, sharp suit, firm handshake. Grandpa Ned held the handshake for 30 seconds, looking at him. Firm grip, he said. The attorney laughed. I watched my grandfather's face and did not laugh at all.